Emma Hayes had always taken immense pride in her professional accomplishments. At 38, she was a renowned architect who had dedicated years to designing buildings that perfectly blended contemporary style with functionality. Following a turbulent divorce and years of prioritizing her career over her personal well-being, Emma finally decided it was time to create a home that truly represented her independence, strength, and creative vision. Choosing a peaceful suburb for her fresh start, Emma sought to distance herself from the hustle and bustle of city life. Her new residence, nestled at the end of a cul-de-sac, was the embodiment of her dream. Every curve and corner of the house reflected her personal touch. The property was enclosed by a sleek yet robust fence, its minimalist design harmonizing with the modern architecture of the house. Emma had also installed automated gates equipped with advanced security systems, ensuring her privacy while maintaining the elegant aesthetic she valued. The front yard, though modest, was meticulously landscaped with lavender, boxwood shrubs, and a well-maintained lawn. It wasn't extravagant, but it stood out amidst the neighborhood's uniform homes and aging picket fences. Emma's neighbors were mostly welcoming, visiting during her first week to introduce themselves. Some even praised her home, though there were polite suggestions that her modern style didn't quite blend with the traditional neighborhood aesthetic. She dismissed these comments, confident that her property adhered to all zoning regulations and architectural standards, leaving her with nothing to worry about. That is, until Karen Baker moved in. Karen resided 3 houses down, a widow in her late 60s with a perfectly manicured front yard and an air of self-appointed authority. Emma encountered Karen on her second day when Karen unexpectedly appeared at her front door. Dressed in a pastel cardigan and holding a clipboard, Karen immediately brandished it like a weapon. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Karen Baker, the head of our HOA. We strive to keep things orderly here, so I thought I'd stop by and go over a few community guidelines. Before we continue with the story, please consider subscribing. It's my dream to once reach 1,000 subscribers." Now back to the story. Emma offered a polite smile, though she disliked Karen's tone. Having dealt with numerous controlling personalities in her profession, Emma recognized the familiar facade. Karen's friendly exterior masked her true intent to exert dominance. "Thank you, Karen. I've already reviewed all the regulations, so I believe I'm all set." Karen's smile tightened further. "Well, I did notice your fence," she began, glancing toward Emma's modern metal enclosure. "It's quite striking, but it does stand out a bit. Most homes on this street embrace a more traditional look." Emma took a steadying breath. "My fence complies with all HOA guidelines. It's within the height restrictions, and the design was approved by the county's zoning office prior to installation." Karen raised an eyebrow. "I'll have to double-check that. Sometimes contractors don't follow the rules as closely as they should." "That won't be necessary," Emma replied firmly but courteously. "I ensured everything was in compliance before construction began." Karen didn't respond immediately. Instead, she offered another strained smile and shifted the conversation to upcoming HOA meetings, subtly implying that attendance was expected. Emma nodded, growing increasingly annoyed by Karen's condescension. When Karen finally left, Emma exhaled deeply and shook her head. She had dealt with plenty like Karen in her career and knew better than to let them affect her. However, Karen's tone and the underlying threat in her words left Emma feeling uneasy. In the days that followed, Emma settled into her new home, dismissing the lingering discomfort Karen had caused. She focused on her work, unpacking, and enjoying the tranquility of the suburb, but her peace was short-lived. Karen began appearing unannounced, finding reasons to visit Emma's door. One day, it was to discuss HOA-approved garbage bin placement. Another time to caution Emma about keeping her hedges trimmed to the prescribed height. Emma remained courteous yet steadfast during these encounters, unwilling to let Karen intimidate her. Her patience started to wear thin when Karen persistently criticized the fence. "It really does give your house a harsh look," Karen remarked one afternoon, watching Emma water her plants from the sidewalk. "Don't you think a white picket fence would be more inviting?" Emma set down the watering can. I appreciate your concern, but my fence is staying. It was designed to match the house and isn't violating any rules. Karen's expression hardened. We'll see about that, she muttered before departing. That evening, Emma reviewed the HOA guidelines again to ensure she was in the clear. Everything was in order. She had all the necessary permits, and her fence met every requirement. Despite this, Karen's persistence continued to trouble Emma. It wasn't just about the fence. Karen seemed determined to control Emma's home and choices. A week later, Emma returned from work to find an envelope taped to her front door. It was from the HOA, containing a formal letter demanding her attendance at a hearing to discuss alleged violations of neighborhood aesthetic standards. The letter specifically cited her fence and warned that non-compliance could lead to fines or mandatory alterations to her property. Emma stared at the letter in frustration. She knew Karen was behind this. It was absurd. She had followed every rule, yet Karen was intent on making her life difficult. For the first time, Emma questioned whether her new neighborhood was the fresh start she had envisioned or if it was turning into a battleground. Emma woke to the sound of metal clattering, loud enough to rouse her from sleep. She sat up, heart racing, straining to hear. Initially, she thought it might be an animal in the yard, but the noise came again, sharp and deliberate, followed by the sound of an engine revving. She jumped out of bed, grabbed her phone, and hurried to the front window. Pulling back the curtain, she froze. Her front yard was in chaos. One side of her sleek, modern fence was completely demolished, with jagged metal pieces scattered across the meticulously maintained lawn. In the midst of the destruction was a massive black SUV, its headlights still on, illuminating the wreckage. Standing beside it, inspecting the damage with infuriating calmness, was Karen. Emma stormed outside, her breath visible in the cool morning air. "Karen!" she called, her voice sharp with anger. "What happened here?" Karen turned, unfazed, and offered a shrug. "Good morning, Emma. I was just backing out of my driveway and, well, your fence got in the way. It's such an awkward design, don't you think? So close to the curb." "Your SUV went through my fence," Emma retorted incredulously. "This fence is on my property. You had no reason to be near it, let alone drive through it." Karen smiled thinly, as if Emma was overreacting. "Actually, this side of the lawn was part of our original plot. My late husband always said so, but the surveyors must have erred years ago. I've been meaning to bring this up at the HOA meeting, but I suppose this is as good a time as any." "That's ridiculous," Emma said, stunned. "The property line is clearly marked, and I have all the paperwork to prove it." "You've destroyed my fence and half my lawn that's not part of the property lines," Emma responded. Karen waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Emma. It's just a fence. Besides, I've already informed the HOA about the situation. We'll sort it out together, like good neighbors. No need to get hostile." "Hostile?" Emma felt a surge of frustration. "You drove through my fence, parked on my lawn, and now you're blaming me for some imaginary property dispute. You're responsible for the damage, Karen. Every penny." Karen's smile didn't falter, but her tone grew colder. "These matters aren't as straightforward as you believe. We'll see what the HOA has to say about your little fence. Until then, I suggest you calm down. It's unbecoming." With that, Karen turned back to her SUV, climbed in, and reversed off Emma's lawn without a second glance, leaving Emma standing amid the wreckage, fuming. As the adrenaline subsided, Emma took photos of the damage. The fence was irreparably twisted where Karen's SUV had plowed through it. The lawn was littered with tire tracks and pieces of broken metal. Her lavender bushes were flattened, and one of the automated gate posts was precariously leaning. Emma called the police to report the incident. An officer arrived about 20 minutes later, his patrol car pulling up beside the mangled fence. He stepped out, clipboard in hand, and surveyed the scene with a low whistle. "Looks like someone didn't know how to use reverse," he remarked, scribbling notes. Emma explained everything. How Karen had driven through her fence, claimed part of the lawn as her own, and then dismissed it as nothing. The officer listened and took notes, but when Emma inquired about pressing charges, his response was disheartening. "Well, ma'am, since it's on private property and no one was injured, this is technically a civil matter. You'll need to file a claim with your insurance company, and if necessary, take it up with the HOA or small claims court." "Are you serious?" Emma asked incredulously. "She destroyed my property. Isn't that vandalism?" she pressed. The officer gave a sympathetic look. "It's a gray area. If you want to pursue it, you need to document everything thoroughly. Photos, receipts for repairs, any communication with her or the HOA. It'll all help if it goes to court." Frustrated but determined, Emma thanked the officer and saw him off. As soon as he left, she began gathering evidence. She photographed the damage from multiple angles, saved the police report number, and compiled documentation of her property line survey, permits, and HOA guidelines. The next morning, Emma received an official letter from the HOA summoning her to a hearing regarding her unauthorized fence installation and possible encroachment on neighboring property. Emma stared at the letter in disbelief. It was clear Karen had acted swiftly to manipulate the situation in her favor. Determined not to let Karen prevail, Emma contacted the surveying company that had handled her property's original boundaries and requested updated documentation. She also reached out to her insurance company to report the incident and began researching local property laws, but Karen wasn't finished. That evening, as Emma returned from a meeting with her insurance adjuster, she noticed something new on her lawn. A small wooden sign hammered into the ground where the fence had been. It read, "Under HOA review, no unauthorized construction." Emma ripped the sign from the ground and marched straight to Karen's house, her patience exhausted. She pounded on the door, and Karen answered with her usual smug demeanor. "Can I help you?" Karen asked, feigning innocence. "Stay off my property," Emma snapped, holding up the sign. "This is harassment, Karen, and I'm not going to tolerate it." Karen crossed her arms, unfazed. "I'm just doing my duty as HOA president. If you can't handle the community's rules, maybe this isn't the right neighborhood for you." Emma took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "You've caused thousands of dollars in damage to my property and are now trying to blame me for your actions. I have documentation, property surveys, permits, even video evidence of your SUV on my lawn. This won't end the way you think it will." For the first time, Karen's facade cracked slightly. Her smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "Do what you need to do, Emma," she said coolly. "But you might find that challenging the HOA is more trouble than it's worth." Emma didn't respond. She turned and walked away, gripping the wooden sign so tightly her knuckles turned white. As she reached her house, she glanced at the remains of her fence and felt a renewed sense of determination. If Karen wanted a war, Emma was ready to fight on her own terms, and she wasn't planning to back down. The HOA hearing was scheduled for the following week, but Emma knew she couldn't wait that long to act. Karen's smugness and her audacity to shift blame had pushed Emma beyond patience. Over the next few days, Emma immersed herself in preparation. She contacted the property surveyor again to secure an updated report of her land's boundaries and combed through every HOA document she could find, arming herself with the necessary information. If Karen wanted to use bureaucracy as a weapon, Emma was prepared to counter it. However, Karen wasn't idle. Every morning, Emma found new reminders of Karen's escalating hostility. On Monday, she woke to discover Karen's black SUV parked halfway onto her lawn, its tires leaving deep ruts in the sod. When Emma knocked on Karen's door to confront her, Karen simply smiled and said, "Oh, it's only temporary. The street gets so crowded these days, don't you think?" By Wednesday, Emma found that one of her sprinklers had been mysteriously smashed, its pieces scattered across the yard. Then came the trash incident. Returning from the grocery store one afternoon, Emma found her recycling bin overturned, its contents strewn across her driveway. She was certain it wasn't the work of animals. There was a deliberate, calculated messiness to it. Karen was nowhere to be seen during these moments, but every time Emma glanced toward her neighbor's house, she felt eyes watching her through the window. It wasn't paranoia. Karen wanted Emma to know she was being targeted. Determined to document everything, Emma began keeping a detailed record. She took photos of the SUV on her lawn, the damaged sprinkler, and the scattered trash. She also called her insurance company to confirm the cost of repairing the fence, which had surged after she learned the gate's motor was irreparably damaged in the collision. The estimate ran into the thousands. The real blow came when Emma received an email from the HOA. It wasn't about the upcoming hearing, but a formal notice informing her of a $2,500 fine for violations of neighborhood upkeep standards. The cited violations included unsightly property damage, improperly maintained landscaping, and hazardous materials left on the lawn. Emma stared at the email, her jaw tightening. She knew exactly what had happened. Karen had twisted the narrative to make Emma's damaged fence and yard appear as though they were her fault. The hazardous materials likely referred to the mangled remains of the fence. Enraged, Emma printed the email and added it to her growing pile of evidence. She called the HOA office immediately, demanding an explanation. But the woman on the phone simply referred her to the upcoming hearing. "That's where these matters are addressed," the woman said in a bored tone, treating Emma as just another nuisance. Emma didn't back down. "I'm not waiting for the hearing to correct false accusations," she said firmly. "I have photographic evidence that the damage to my property was caused by another resident. Karen Baker, specifically." The woman hesitated for a moment before replying. "Well, Miss Hayes, the hearing is also a chance for you to provide evidence in your defense. I suggest you prepare your case thoroughly." The passive-aggressive dismissal in the woman's voice made Emma want to scream, but she hung up and focused on what she could control. The next morning, Emma took further action. She hired a contractor to inspect the damage to her fence and prepare a detailed report to submit as part of her defense at the hearing. The contractor, a burly man named Greg, shook his head as he examined the property. "This isn't just a simple collision," he said, pointing to the crumpled gate. "Whoever did this didn't stop at the first impact. Look here, you can see where the vehicle pushed forward again. This wasn't an accident." Emma felt a chill. She had suspected Karen's actions were more than mere carelessness, but hearing it confirmed by someone else deepened her unease. "Make sure you include that in the report," she instructed. "I need every detail for the hearing." Greg nodded. "Will do. And you might want to consider some extra security measures, cameras maybe." Emma had already thought of that. The following day, she had a professional security system installed. Cameras now covered every angle of her property, from the front yard to the back. The system was linked to her phone, allowing her to monitor the footage in real time. She didn't care if Karen noticed the cameras. In fact, she hoped she did. But Karen wasn't the type to back down just because she'd been caught on camera. However, Karen wasn't deterred. That weekend, as Emma reviewed her evidence and prepared for the hearing, she heard the unmistakable rumble of Karen's SUV again. She rushed to the window, phone in hand, just in time to see the vehicle inching onto her lawn. Emma burst out the door, camera rolling, but Karen was already stepping out of the car, holding a stack of papers. "Good afternoon, Emma," Karen said with that familiar, condescending smile. "I thought I'd drop off some additional information for the hearing, just to keep things transparent." Emma stared at her incredulously. "Transparent? You mean like how you transparently drove through my fence and then blamed me for it?" Karen's smile didn't falter. "Well, we all have our perspectives, don't we? Anyway, I think you'll find these documents enlightening. They outline some historical property lines for this neighborhood. It's fascinating, really." Emma snatched the papers from Karen's hands, glancing at them briefly. They were a mix of old surveys and handwritten notes, none of which looked remotely official. "This is nonsense," Emma said, holding up the papers. "And you know it. My property lines are legally documented and up to date." "You're grasping at straws, Karen," Emma continued. Karen tilted her head, her smile hardening into something colder. "We'll see what the HOA has to say. It's always best to let the proper authorities decide these matters." Emma stepped closer, her voice low and steady. "Stay off my lawn. Stay away from my property. And stop trying to intimidate me, Karen. It won't work. Karen's eyes narrowed, but she didn't respond. She climbed back into her SUV and drove off, the tires kicking up dirt as she left. As Emma watched her go, a sense of resolve settled over her. The hearing was days away, but Emma was ready. Karen wanted to play games, but Emma wasn't the type to lose when it came to defending what was hers. The day of the HOA hearing arrived, and Emma was prepared for battle. She entered the sterile conference room at the HOA office with a thick binder in hand, containing every piece of evidence she had meticulously gathered. Photographs of the damaged fence and lawn, video stills of Karen's SUV parked on her property, the contractor's detailed report, property surveys proving her legal boundary lines, and a timeline of Karen's escalating behavior. Her lawyer, a sharp woman named Stephanie Reed, accompanied her, adding a layer of professional confidence that Emma desperately needed. Karen was already there, seated at the head of the long table as though she were presiding over the meeting. She wore her usual pastel cardigan and a smug expression, flanked by two other HOA board members who looked as though they had been personally vetted to support her. A few other neighbors sat along the sides of the room, likely there out of curiosity. Emma caught the eye of Tom, the one neighbor who had quietly offered her support, and he gave her a subtle nod of encouragement. The meeting began with Karen clearing her throat and addressing the room with a voice dripping in authority. Thank you all for coming today. As you know, we are here to discuss a series of violations and disputes involving Miss Emma Hayes. These issues include property encroachment, non-compliance with neighborhood aesthetic standards, and damage to communal property. Emma's eyebrows shot up at the mention of communal property. Karen continued, unfazed, as if she hadn't just lied through her teeth. It is our responsibility as a community to ensure that every resident adheres to the guidelines we've all agreed upon. This is what maintains the character and harmony of our neighborhood. Stephanie leaned over and whispered, "Let her dig her hole. We'll handle it." When it was Emma's turn to speak, she stood and addressed the room, her voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. I'd like to correct several misstatements made here today. First and foremost, my property is fully compliant with all HOA regulations, as outlined in the documents I've provided. The fence was professionally installed, and the design was approved by zoning officials before construction. Secondly, she continued, I'd like to address the claim of property encroachment, which is entirely baseless. Emma opened her binder and passed copies of her property survey to the board members, including Karen, who barely glanced at it. As you can see, the survey confirms that the fence is well within my property lines. The allegations to the contrary are nothing more than unfounded speculation. Karen interrupted, her tone sharp. Speculation. The original property lines for this neighborhood were documented decades ago. Just because you have a newer survey doesn't mean it overrides the historical layout of this area. Stephanie stepped in, her calm demeanor slicing through Karen's bluster. Actually, it does. Under state law, legally recorded property surveys take precedence over any informal or outdated maps. Unless you have an updated survey of your own, Miss Baker, your claims hold no legal weight. Karen's lips thinned, but she recovered quickly. Well, even if the property lines are technically correct, there's still the issue of neighborhood aesthetics. Miss Hayes' fence is an eyesore, and several residents have complained about how it disrupts the harmony of the street. Emma fought the urge to roll her eyes. If there are complaints, I'd like to see them. Karen smirked and produced a stack of papers from her bag. Gladly. These are statements from your neighbors expressing their concerns about your fence. Then Emma scanned the documents as Stephanie flipped through them beside her. Most were generic complaints about the fence being too modern or out of place. Emma recognized a few names and suspected Karen had pressured them into writing these letters. Stephanie pulled out one in particular and held it up. This letter, Stephanie said, is unsigned. Do we have any confirmation that it actually came from a resident? Karen waved her hand dismissively. Not everyone feels comfortable putting their name on complaints. That doesn't make them any less valid. In a legal context, Anonymous complaints are not considered credible evidence, especially in disputes involving property rights. Stephanie replied smoothly. Karen's composure cracked slightly, but she quickly shifted gears. Regardless, the damage to Miss Hayes' property was caused by you. Emma cut in, unable to stay silent any longer. The room fell silent, all eyes on Emma as she stood and flipped to a specific section in her binder. Here is photographic evidence of Miss Baker's SUV parked on my lawn multiple times. Here is the police report documenting her collision with my fence. And here, she said, pulling out a still frame from her security footage, is video evidence of her vehicle causing further damage to my property. She handed the documents to the board members, one of whom visibly paled as he glanced at the footage. Karen's face remained frozen, but her knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of the table. Stephanie took over, her voice calm but firm. This evidence not only exonerates my client, but also implicates Miss Baker in a pattern of harassment and property damage. Furthermore, the fine imposed on Miss Hayes for so-called unsightly property damage is clearly a retaliatory action orchestrated by Miss Baker to deflect blame. We demand that the fine be revoked immediately and that the HOA investigate Miss Baker's misuse of her authority as president. The room buzzed with murmurs as the board members exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a man in his 50s who looked particularly uncomfortable, cleared his throat. This is a serious matter. I think we need to review all the evidence before making any decisions. Karen attempted to regain control. There's no need for a full review. No, Emma interrupted, her voice firm. This is a pattern of bullying, and it's gone on long enough. I've complied with every rule, followed every guideline, and yet I'm the one being fined and dragged through these ridiculous accusations. It's time for this to stop. The board members seemed to shrink under Emma's glare. Tom, sitting quietly in the back, finally spoke up. I've lived here for 10 years, and I've seen this happen before. Karen's used her position in the HOA to go after anyone who doesn't do things her way. It's about time someone stood up to her. Karen shot him a venomous look, but the damage was done. The room was turning against her, and she knew it. After a tense pause, one of the board members finally spoke. We'll need to adjourn this meeting and review the evidence before making a decision. Until then, all fines against Miss Hayes are suspended. The board member concluded. Karen opened her mouth to protest, but the board member cut her off. That's final. Emma exhaled, the tension in her chest easing slightly. It wasn't over, but it was a step in the right direction. Karen's composure was gone, her face flushed with anger as she gathered her things and stormed out of the room. As Emma left the meeting, Stephanie turned to her with a rare smile. You handled yourself well in there. Emma nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. Karen might have initiated the fight, but Emma was determined to finish it, and this time she had the upper hand. The victory at the HOA hearing was short-lived. While the board had temporarily suspended the fines and promised to review the evidence, Karen was clearly not willing to let it rest. Over the next few days, Emma felt the pressure intensify as Karen shifted her tactics from direct confrontation to a more insidious form of harassment. It began subtly. Emma's mailbox was suddenly inundated with HOA notices almost every day, more than usual. There were petty complaints about her property, excessive weeds in her garden, which didn't exist, unapproved lighting fixtures on her porch, and even a bizarre claim that her trash bins were placed at an unsafe angle on collection days. Each notice demanded action, accompanied by thinly veiled threats of additional fines. At first, Emma ignored them, knowing Karen was trying to bury her in paperwork and harass her into submission. But then, one morning, she found a bright orange tag taped to her front door, declaring that her home was under review for unauthorized structural modifications. The notice stated that an inspection would be conducted in the coming week, and any violations found could result in further penalties. Emma's frustration boiled over. The so-called unauthorized structural modifications were non-existent. Her home was built according to the strictest codes and regulations, with every element approved before construction. But she knew this wasn't about rules or regulations. This was Karen leveraging her position in the HOA to make Emma's life as difficult as possible. Emma's lawyer, Stephanie, advised her to stay calm and continue documenting everything. "This kind of harassment can work against her if we escalate the case," Stephanie said. "The more baseless accusations she throws your way, the more ammunition you have to prove her misuse of power." But Karen wasn't done. Late one night, as Emma sat reviewing her paperwork in the living room, she noticed headlights outside her window. She peeked through the curtains and saw Karen's SUV idling across the street. Karen wasn't alone. Another car, a smaller sedan, was parked behind hers. Two figures stood in Emma's driveway, their shadows stretching across the lawn under the dim glow of the streetlights. Emma's heart raced. She grabbed her phone and quietly opened the security app connected to her cameras. Switching to the live feed, she zoomed in on the figures. One was Karen, holding a flashlight and pointing at different parts of Emma's property. The other, a man in a dark jacket, was scribbling notes on a clipboard. "What are they doing?" Emma muttered, hitting the record button on the app. Karen and the man spent the next 15 minutes walking the perimeter of Emma's property, shining the flashlight at her fence, landscaping, and even her windows. They spoke in hushed tones, but the cameras captured snippets of their conversation. "Clear violation," the man said at one point, gesturing toward the fence. Karen responded with a laugh. "I told you she thinks she's above the rules. We'll put an end to that." Emma's hands shook with anger as she watched them. It was clear Karen had enlisted this man, likely some kind of HOA inspector or associate, to fabricate more violations. Emma debated confronting them, but Stephanie's voice echoed in her mind. Document everything. So she stayed inside, recording until they finally left. The next morning, Emma awoke to find another notice taped to her door. This one accused her of unauthorized alterations to the property boundary and stated that the HOA would conduct a formal review of her home within 48 hours. It also included a new fine, $3,000, for repeated violations. That was the last straw. Emma called Stephanie, her voice trembling with anger. "She was on my property last night with someone, fabricating violations. I have it all on camera. What do we do now?" Stephanie's tone was calm but firm. "We escalate. I'm filing an injunction to stop the HOA from issuing any further fines until this matter is resolved. And we'll send a cease and desist letter to Karen, warning her that her actions constitute harassment and trespassing. I also suggest involving the police. They may not have taken much action before, but with video evidence of Karen on your property, they'll have to take it seriously. At the very least, it'll send a message." Emma agreed and sent the footage to both Stephanie and the local police department. By the end of the day, Stephanie had filed the necessary paperwork, and Emma felt a small sense of relief knowing she was finally fighting back. But Karen wasn't done. The following evening, Emma returned home to find her lawn completely trashed. Someone had dumped piles of dirt and mulch all over the grass, burying her flower beds and creating an intentional-looking mess. Her security cameras hadn't captured the culprit directly, but Emma had no doubt who was behind it. She spent hours cleaning up the mess, seething with rage. Karen was escalating, clearly unwilling to stop, until she broke Emma's resolve or forced her out of the neighborhood entirely. The turning point came when Tom, the neighbor who had quietly supported Emma during the hearing, knocked on her door later that night. He looked nervous, glancing over his shoulder as if afraid someone might see him. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. Emma nodded and stepped aside, gesturing for him to sit. "What's going on?" Tom hesitated before speaking. "I don't want to get involved, but I think you should know something. Karen's been talking to some of the other neighbors, trying to get them to sign a petition to have you removed from the HOA entirely. She's claiming you're a troublemaker, making the neighborhood unsafe." Emma's jaw dropped. "Can she even do that?" Tom shrugged. "Technically, no, but if she gets enough people to back her, she could make your life even harder. And well, some of the neighbors are afraid to say no to her. She has a way of making things difficult for people who don't agree with her." Emma sighed, her frustration mounting. "Why are you telling me this, Tom?" "Because it's wrong," he said simply. She's been doing this for years, picking targets, harassing them until they either fall in line or leave. I've seen her do it to 3 other families. Most people are too scared to stand up to her, but I think you might actually have a chance to stop her." Emma nodded, her resolve hardening. "Thanks, Tom. I appreciate you letting me know." After he left, Emma sat in silence, staring at the pile of evidence on her table. Karen had crossed every possible line: harassment, trespassing, destruction of property, and she was still pushing, trying to tighten her grip on the neighborhood. Emma knew she couldn't let Karen win. It wasn't just about the fence or the fines anymore. It was about standing up to someone who had bullied her way through life, using fear and manipulation to control everyone around her. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Later that night, Emma received a notification from her security system on the nightstand. Groggy, she opened the app and froze when she saw the live feed. Karen was back on her property, but this time she wasn't alone. 2 men in dark clothing were with her, shining flashlights around Emma's backyard. One of them appeared to be dragging a sack of gravel while the other carried a tool set. Her pulse quickened as she watched the group work. Karen pointed toward the side of the house, and the men began hammering stakes into the ground, stringing bright orange construction tape between them. It looked almost like they were marking off a new boundary line. Emma didn't wait to piece together what they were planning. She grabbed her phone and dialed the non-emergency police line, explaining the situation to the dispatcher in as much detail as she could. "They're on my property right now," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "I have security footage proving they've been trespassing multiple times. I need officers here immediately." The dispatcher assured her that a unit was on the way, and Emma stayed on the line, watching the live feed as Karen and her accomplices continued their bizarre work. One of the men finished hammering the stakes and began digging a shallow trench along the line they had marked. 15 minutes later, red and blue lights illuminated the cul-de-sac. Karen froze when she heard the sirens, her head snapping toward the street. The 2 men with her exchanged panicked glances, and one of them dropped his tools, muttering something Emma couldn't hear. Emma stepped outside just as the officers arrived, her phone in hand with the security footage queued up. She pointed toward the backyard. "They're back there. They've been trespassing and damaging my property." Karen emerged from the shadows, her expression a mix of indignation and feigned innocence. "What's going on here?" she demanded, hands on her hips. One of the officers turned to her. "Ma'am, we received a call about trespassing. Are you aware that you're on someone else's property without permission?" Karen's face turned red. "This is a misunderstanding. I'm the president of the HOA, and this is official business. We're conducting a review of property lines." Emma stepped forward, her voice cutting through Karen's excuses. "That's a lie. I have proof that this isn't the first time you've been on my property without permission, and I have no idea who these men are." The officer gestured for Emma to show her phone, and she played the footage of Karen and her accomplices hammering stakes into the ground. The officer's expression hardened as he watched. "Ma'am," he said, turning back to Karen, "this is clearly private property. You have no legal authority to perform any kind of survey or make modifications here. You're trespassing." Karen's composure began to crack. "But the property lines are clearly marked and legally recorded." Emma interrupted. "I've already submitted evidence to the HOA and my lawyer proving that my fence and boundaries are compliant. This is harassment, plain and simple." The officers questioned the 2 men, who were quick to deny any wrongdoing. "She hired us," one of them said, nodding toward Karen. "We are just contractors doing what she told us to." Karen's face flushed a deeper shade of red, but she recovered quickly. "I was acting in the best interest of the community. If Miss Hayes refuses to cooperate, we have to take matters into our own hands." The officer shook his head. "That's not how this works. You're trespassing and you've caused property damage. Miss Hayes has every right to press charges if she chooses." Emma didn't hesitate. "I do." Her voice was firm. Karen's eyes widened. "This is ridiculous. You're going to regret this, Emma." But her threats fell flat. The officers escorted Karen and her contractors off the property, taking down their information and warning them not to return. As they left, Emma felt a strange mix of relief and anger. The next day, Emma met with Stephanie to finalize her case against Karen. Armed with the security footage, the police report, and evidence of Karen's escalating harassment, Stephanie was confident they had a strong case for both civil damages and a restraining order. At the same time, word of the incident spread through the neighborhood. Several residents who had once supported Karen began to distance themselves, realizing the extent of her behavior. Tom stopped by to inform Emma that he had heard whispers of other neighbors planning to file complaints against Karen with the HOA. "She's losing her grip," Tom said, leaning against the doorframe. "It's about time." Emma nodded. "I just want this to be over." The culmination came at the next HOA meeting, where Emma and Stephanie presented their case. Karen, flanked by her dwindling number of allies, tried to dismiss the evidence as exaggerations and misunderstandings. But Stephanie's sharp arguments and the undeniable proof left the board with no choice. The HOA not only ruled in Emma's favor, but also voted to strip Karen of her position as president. Additionally, the board agreed to pay for the damages to Emma's property using HOA funds, further cementing Karen's public humiliation. Karen left the meeting in silence, her face pale and expression tight. For the first time since Emma had moved in, Karen had nothing to say. In the weeks following Karen's removal as HOA president, the neighborhood underwent a noticeable transformation. Without Karen's oppressive presence, the atmosphere seemed lighter, and Emma felt the tension she had been carrying for months finally begin to ease. The new interim HOA president, a mild-mannered man named Bill, visited Emma personally to apologize for the trouble Karen had caused. He assured her that the board was taking steps to reform its practices, including implementing stricter oversight to prevent future abuse of power. Bill also confirmed that the HOA would fully cover the costs of repairing Emma's fence and landscaping, and they had already approved her contractor to start the work. Despite this progress, Emma knew the ordeal wasn't entirely over. Karen had gone quiet after her public humiliation, but silence didn't mean surrender. Emma remained vigilant, continuing to monitor her security system and documenting any unusual activity. However, Karen seemed to vanish from the neighborhood entirely. Her black SUV was no longer parked in her driveway, and her blinds were perpetually drawn. The rumor among the neighbors was that Karen had gone to stay with relatives in another town, unwilling to face the fallout of her actions. The repairs to Emma's property began promptly. The new fence was even sturdier than the last, with reinforced steel posts and a fresh coat of sleek black paint. Her lawn, once trampled and torn, was replanted with care, and the lavender bushes were restored to their original beauty. Watching the transformation gave Emma a sense of closure. Her home, her sanctuary, was finally hers again. One evening, as she sat on her porch sipping tea, Tom stopped by with a bottle of wine. "Thought you could use a proper celebration," he said with a grin. Emma laughed and invited him to sit. They toasted to the end of Karen's reign and chatted about the changes in the neighborhood. Tom shared stories of other residents who had quietly endured Karen's bullying for years, relieved that someone had finally stood up to her. "You did more than just fix a fence," Tom said. "You showed everyone that we don't have to put up with people like her." Emma smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't experienced in months. That's no small thing. For the first time since moving to the neighborhood, she felt like she truly belonged. The next morning, Emma received a letter in the mail. Her heart sank when she saw Karen's name on the return address. She opened it cautiously, half expecting another round of petty threats. Instead, the letter was short and surprisingly subdued. "I've decided to sell my house and leave the neighborhood. I suppose congratulations are in order. You've won. I hope you're satisfied, Emma." Emma folded the letter and placed it on the table. The words felt hollow, devoid of the venom that had defined every interaction with Karen. She didn't feel triumph or satisfaction, only relief that it was finally over. With Karen gone, the neighborhood settled into a peaceful rhythm. The HOA began addressing real issues rather than inventing conflicts, and the sense of community grew stronger. Emma started hosting small gatherings at her house, inviting neighbors over for drinks and conversation. It was a far cry from the hostile environment she had first encountered. One evening, as she stood in her newly restored yard, watching the sun set behind her finished fence, Emma allowed herself to finally exhale. The battle had been long and draining, but she had emerged stronger, more resilient, and more determined than ever to protect what was hers. Her house was no longer just a place to live. It was a testament to her ability to stand her ground, no matter the odds.